Welcome to Parks Unplugged. My name is Monica and I'm the Parks Manager for Kensington and Chelsea. Today our focus is on trees. Trees are a really fascinating subject and we have some very unusual, quite special trees in this borough. I'm really happy to say that I've cajoled two of our arboriculture officers into joining our podcast today, James and Jess. So can you both just quickly introduce yourselves and tell us what your roles are in the council?
Hi, my name's Jess and I am an arboricultural officer, or tree officer at the council. I started in 2020, so starting my 5th year soon.
Hi, I am James Burton. I'm a senior arboriculture officer at the council and I have been here nearly 20 years.
Thank you. Also, if it's okay, I will stop saying arboriculture and just start saying trees. Arboriculture doesn't roll off the tongue very well, and I'm very mindful of getting a reel of outtakes from our comms team of me trying and failing to say it clearly. So, into the deep stuff. Why trees? How did you get into the world of tree management?
I by accident, really. I was living in Australia and a friend that I was sharing a house with was working as a tree surgeon in Queensland and needed an extra pair of hands for the day, and I helped him and found it quite interesting and just thought he suggested that where we live in England there was a good college teaching tree surgery. So when I came back to England in 1998, I then went to college and got into the industry that way.
I also fell into it. So I was working in something completely different and not enjoying it particularly. So it was actually my dad who suggested that I do something that aligned more with my interests. So that being nature and being outdoors. So I became a tree surgeon for a bit, and then when the opportunity came up to become a tree officer, so doing more of the assessments of the trees rather than climbing and pruning, I took that opportunity and started working as a tree officer.
Do you know, this is one of the things I'm really enjoying actually doing about this podcast is the amount of time that I've known you both, and I've never actually asked you that question. So this is actually really
ignorance, Monica.
Yeah, I know. So, I mean, talking about having worked with you both for so many years now, I'm kind of always in awe of the amount of knowledge that you have. I mean, I've worked in parks now for coming up to 17 years. I can do the bare basics. Ask me to identify anything beyond that, especially any type of conifer, I'm completely done for. So how much study is involved to get to where you are?
Initially, I went to college full-time for 2 years and did a national diploma in arboriculture. And I've then returned in 2010 to do another level 5 qualification as a technician certificate in arboriculture. But that was done as a day release. So initially 2 years, but it's an industry that there hasn't been research into it for very long. So even stuff that I learned in the late 90s, in 2010, you go back to college and that was already out of date and had been superseded by something else. So it's a rolling kind of continual process of learning. And I bore everyone in my family and colleagues with learning about trees. But, you know, even when you're walking down the street, doesn't matter where you are pretty much in the world, you are in a way connected with the job that you do back here, because you're always seeing trees in an urban environment and you might learn a new relationship between a tree and a fungus, or a different species of tree working in a different environment. And there's trees in this borough that I've planted because I saw them work well on holiday, and and then have sort of used them back in this borough. So I mean, so in terms of learning, you are continually learning, but formally I did 2 years at the beginning of my career.
Did you go down the same route, Jess?
So I started doing a tree surgery course for 8 weeks, and so that was very practical, sort of gave us the basics of tree species and identification. And then last year I completed my foundation degree in arboriculture and tree management. But it very much is a job, as James was describing, that you do learn every day something new. Different places, for example, have different management styles. So the London Tree Officers Association is doing a trip to Sweden in June this year, so we're going there to learn more about how they're managing their trees over in Sweden, and as James said, you sort of bring back new information and can apply it here on the job. So it is, in fact, Kensington and Chelsea is a really lovely place to work in particular, because we do have such a variety of trees, and so you even get to learn the weird and wonderful kind of non-native trees that we have here, and are growing really successfully. We found black pepper trees the other day, didn't we, after a trip to
Yes.
The Chelsea Physic Garden, and then there are two trees.
They were given, they're in the gardens along Sloane Square, and you can see, I just pointed them out to Jess because somebody pointed them out to me years ago, and you can see the fruit. So the fruit is in effect peppercorns, and they're covered in fruit at the minute. So there is a huge and wide variety of trees, both in the streets and in the parks of this borough.
So thinking about that, if you had to choose what is your standout tree in the borough?
Oh, it's like choosing a child. Who's your favourite kid? I think it depends on the time of year. You know, like there's some plane trees in Cornwall Gardens that I love because they're just huge. But you know, there's hundreds of plane trees in this borough, so they're not particularly special, but sometimes you might just go around the corner and there's 2 cherry trees outside a house and it just works really well. So, but as an individual, I don't know. I'll have to come back to that, Jess.
I don't have one. I agree. I think this borough is quite special because a lot of the residents take good care of their trees, and so they sort of complement our street tree planting in a way. And so, for example, we've just had the magnolias come into, they're kind of on the last part of their flowering period, but it looks absolutely stunning, you know, turning down streets and seeing privately owned magnolias, and then we've got some beautiful ones at the bottom of Hornton Street that are managed by us, and then in autumn we've got all the sweet gums, some of the ginkgos. Just, yeah, I would agree, at different times of year the trees all come into their own.
I have thought of, there is a tree I particularly, it's not the best example of that species, but just down off Sloane Square in the south of the borough, we have a coast redwood growing as a street tree, which I think one of my predecessors probably planted as, thought it was something else. But I like the fact that we have a specimen of the world's tallest tree just growing 50 metres from Sloane Square and miles away from its native range in Northern California. So.
But they make really good urban trees, and they are on the list for ones that are more resilient with regards to climate change, so perhaps we'll see more.
Maybe. I mean, do you know, the one that you mentioned actually, Hornton Street, that small cluster of magnolias there, that is actually a standout for me. It's one of those streets where it's such a small sort of segment between Hornton Street, you know, getting to Kensington High Street, and when the magnolias are in flower, it just really just lifts that whole little patch when you're coming out of the town hall and going back up to the high street. That is definitely a standout. I guess, what is you spoke about climate resilience, what is the biggest challenge facing our trees?
I think we've got a few. I mean, the urban environment is already quite a hostile place to be growing trees because of potential compaction, but also limited rooting space, the reflected heat from buildings and the ground, and so actually non-native trees can work much better in our streets because of those sort of less than native climatic conditions. But subsidence is probably one that's a bigger threat for us. In the north of the borough we've got clay soils, and obviously clay soils are prone to shrinking and expanding quite rapidly, and as a result trees can often be implicated in subsidence cases, and at the moment the outcomes tend to be that the tree needs to be pruned harshly or removed if you know they are found to be causing subsidence. So that's tricky because as we are projected to have hotter summers, it's more likely that more of our trees will be implicated and potentially felled. And so it'll be a case of trying to keep ahead of the game and finding trees that are less water intensive and planting those where we can to see if we can just ensure that we're increasing our tree stock and preparing for that.
We need to be mindful of not just the changing climate, but just the threat of lots of diseases coming in, particularly from the continent, that are, that have devastated some tree populations in Europe. And if you look at sort of diseases affecting London plains, well, genetically, the pool of London plane trees in central London is tiny. So we have to be realistic that these diseases that have devastated trees in Europe, they're not here now necessarily, but it would be naive of us to think that they won't arrive on these shores and affect our tree population. So trying to diversify the species that we use, particularly in the streets and also in the parks, just to kind of future-proof our trees, because being realistic, London plane trees aren't going to be here forever. So trying to find out what will be a usable substitute when the time comes that all those trees won't be there anymore.
And looking out for research where there are cultivars that are less susceptible to, the elms are a prime example of where Dutch elm disease ravished a lot of the elms in the UK, and now we're able to plant certain cultivars that are less susceptible, and we can just hope that perhaps there are London plane cultivars that we can, we've got Holland Park Avenue, which is an absolutely amazing avenue of trees. And speaking of, what our favourite trees might be in the borough, I think that's got to be one of my favourite places, because we're able to grow them as full canopy trees. They were pollarded a while ago, and now we've grown them out, so they look fantastic. And it would be it would be devastating if the Crankstein plane did come over to the UK, and we ended up having to remove that whole avenue. But that's not happening yet, and if we do find cultivars that we can replace the trees with that are less susceptible, then that would be a success story.
I think that's a really important point that you make. It's about trees having the right space to grow, and I think that also comes in sort of thinking about standout trees in the borough. I'm a really big fan of just English oak, but when it has space to grow and reach its full size, it's a really quite special thing, and the amount of wildlife that it supports. But it is that sort of, I was going to say that kind of right tree, right place, which sounds so cliche, but it's so true.
It is important.
And it's so, when you see trees that reach their full size and their full potential, it's something very, very different, and it's really special. I guess, so a lot of our trees are under threat. So like the kind of big threats at the moment, obviously, I think that I'm aware of, like I said, London planes, but also ash. There's so many coming in. So I guess you mentioned diversifying the portfolio, but is there anything else we can do? Is there anything that people can be more mindful of to help prevent spread of certain diseases? Is there things that people should consider in their own gardens?
Try and try and spend a bit of time looking at the sourcing of your trees, like oak processionary moth, which has been a huge problem in this country, particularly in the southeast, with public health sort of connotations as well, was brought in 2005, I think, completely unnecessarily. The species of tree it was bought on, you can buy in any UK nursery, yet to save a relatively small amount of money, these trees were imported from Holland. They weren't properly checked, and there we have a disease introduced to this country where it didn't need to be. That tree managers, we are now spending hundreds of millions of pounds a year managing something that initially, if someone hadn't tried saving a couple of £100, it would never have been brought into this country. So Xylella fastidiosa is an even more significant disease, because it affects so many plants, not necessarily trees, but smaller stuff like plants. and herbaceous stuff, and that comes in on lavender, on olives, and so just looking for properly sourced, more reputable nurseries as well. I'd always recommend people to go to those, and if they're buying trees, go to reputable UK nurseries. There isn't any need to really go and source trees on the continent, and if they are sourced and brought to this country, then they should probably just inquire with your nursery you're buying it off whether it's been put into quarantine for a year as it should. And just simple rules like that.
And plant health certificates, plant passports, all the rest of it. DEFRA find it really, really hard to monitor online sales of plants particularly, so I think this is probably more likely to happen with herbaceous plants, just buying them online from some random seller. So yeah, just avoiding that, make sure that they are reputable. And I think the other thing I would say is that if you are getting tree work done, to select a contractor from the Arboricultural Association's approved list, because then they'll adhere to biosecurity guidance and regulations. So yeah, I'd recommend that too.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. This has been really, really insightful, and I really appreciate you allowing me to convince you to take part.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica.
That's nearly all for this episode. You will have heard a few Latin names used on this podcast for plants and trees, and I want to talk about this because it's something I found really frustrating first getting into this business, was everyone using Latin and botanical names for plants rather than common names. And it felt to me at the time to be a bit sort of snobby and exclusive because I didn't understand it. But over time I've learned that there are reasons why people who have studied the subject prefer the botanical names. So at its simplest, plants have two main names, the genus and the species. The genus represents plants that are related, have similar characteristics, or originate from the same family, a bit like our surnames. And the species describes one kind of plant in that genus, like our first names. The reason people like the Latin names is that they can tell us a lot about the characteristics of that plant. For example, anything with sempervirens means the plant is evergreen. Sempervirens, I think, translates as something like always living, so it's used to mean evergreen plants. Macrophylla means large leaves. Anything with odoratus or fragrance means it has a scent. A nice example is Clematis montana. Clematis is the genus and Montana is the species. It's essentially Clematis from the mountains. There is also a variety of Clematis montana which is called grandiflora, which then tells us that this particular plant has large flowers. There are many examples like this of how plant names can tell you so much about the plant, and it's really worth looking up. The other reason people prefer botanical names is that common names are not universal and vary a lot, with wildly different names for the same plant, and sometimes the same common name can be used for more than one plant. One of the more quirky examples that I have is dead man's fingers, which is used for both the Decaisnea tree, which has long purple seed pods, and is also used for the fungus Xylaria polymorpha, which comes out of the ground in clusters of, well, fingers. Apologies to anyone out there who is cringing at my pronunciation of these. I'm not always sure how they're supposed to sound, but that's the way I'm reading them. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is please don't be intimidated by the world of plants and trees. I've always found as a novice that when people are using botanical names and I have no clue what they're talking about, they're usually very happy to tell me common names or help me with an ident. This is definitely an industry driven by passion for the subject, and I really hope that comes across in this podcast, so please don't be put off. Thank you for listening. Please join us again for our next episode, and please do send us any questions or suggestions, and you can send these to parks@rbkc.gov.uk.